hear me. That should be a little bit better. Good morning, good morning, good morning. This is Robert Frank. This is February the 16th, 2019. And we're going to continue reading from the book that we're reading from as of right this time. The Amazing World of Kreskin by Kreskin. It's a fun and interesting book. It's about a mentalist who appeared on Merv Griffin and a lot of other different shows over the years. And we left off with chapter 9. So starting with chapter 9, I will continue to read on. Hopeful of spontaneity, praying for something offbeat to happen, aside from personal problems, I never know exactly what I'm going to do or how the experiment will turn out. During one Johnny Carson show with singer Jack Jones and comedian Marilyn Michaels appearing as guests, I decided to switch the format. I was scheduled to do a chalk writing demonstration, cause a piece of chalk between two slates to write a telepathically received name, and had written out some 150 names on the backs of calling cards. Flip Wilson, Peter Nero, Harry Mancini, and others. Jones and Miss Michaels were to select a card, concentrate on that particular name, and my role was to perceive it, then cause the chalk to write the name. We'd planned to do 4 or 5 names. However, glancing at the clock, I realized we were running late and could not cover more than 1 or 2 names. I decided it would be more dramatic to have Miss Michaels think of a name, any name, and then proceed with the balance of the test. I took the 2 black slates, which had been wiped clean, and I gave them to the guest after soaking a piece of chalk in a glass of water. To make certain I'd get an impression, I inserted the chalk between the 2 slates. They were then tightly bound with elastic, while Jones and Miss Michaels held them parallel over the floor. I told Marilyn to think of someone she knew that no one else in the studio audience would be likely to know. In particular, it would be someone I could not possibly know myself. Marilyn soon nodded and informed Jones of the name. They began to concentrate. I experienced considerable difficulty because the name was very complex. Mentally spell it out, please, I requested. Finally, getting what I thought to be the name, I proceeded to the 3rd sequence of the effect, which was to manipulate the chalk and make it right, even though I was 7 or 8 feet away from the slates. As Jones removed the elastic and opened the 2 slates, I was relieved to see that the chalk had rolled and the name of O-I-S-H-E was spelled out. Again, I'd had the fear of failure when a TV camera is focused in close. Marilyn was visibly shaken, almost hysterical. The program shifted to a commercial so she could gather herself together. Moshi Oshii, her uncle, a famous cantor, had been dead since the 40s. Only Marilyn, within the studio, could have been thinking about him. This impromptu demonstration was an example of energy force. but not psychokinesis, in which objects are moved by sheer mental will force. The chalk writing isn't an effect, and I label it as such. Another example of this occurrence on the Merv Griffin show, before I'm accused of name dropping, I cite these examples because they were performed in full public view, with known and reputable persons involved. In this case, a dozen or so people, Griffin, 2 technicians, in close observation. The participants were vocalist Delta Reese and the husband-wife team of Ellie Wallash and Annie Jackson. I select Annie and Delta as a subject, asking Delta to tear out some cigarette papers from a roll your own folder, then press them into tiny balls. After she had arranged them on the coffee table, I instructed her to pick up one of them and place it in the palm of her hand, then close the palm tightly. Turning to Annie Jackson, I asked her to concentrate on some famous person in American history, and that the person be deceased. I often make the latter request to avoid names in current news. In a moment, I received her impression and said, "Annie, you seem to be picturing the person sitting down." I told her several times that he appeared to be confined in something. She nodded, startled. Then I received the total image. The person you're picturing is in late life and ill. He's Franklin D. Roosevelt. With that registered, I told Delta to unroll the tiny ball of paper she was holding and to dust cigarette ashes over it. That took a few seconds, then she shrieked, and the camera moved in for a close-up of FDR, formed in ashes on the crumpled paper. At this point, I can understand a reader reaction of hold it. By limiting the famous person to the deceased, you narrow down your field. You could have tricked or pre-treated the paper, possibly, but that would mean trickling papers for perhaps 50,000 deceased persons from Washington and Patrick Henry and John Paul Jones to Eisenhower, John Kennedy. I'd have to lug a truckload of cigarette papers from performance to performance. And on any given day or night, a subject would pop an oddball, Jesse James, Brother Frank, on me, for which I hadn't prepared a paper. Truly, I can't think of a more complicated way to accomplish 5 minutes of entertainment. Yet I have found that I cannot resist this type of before your very eyes effect. I'm as much a fan of them as everyone in a simple, pure audience. When I see a new one, I gasp and react with the same. How was that done? In the 30s, there was a very creative effects inventor named Samuel C. Hooker. He wasn't a professional magician, but was always the first true scholar of sorcery. He conceived an effect in which cards would rise, on command, from a drinking glass or goblet. Initially, magicians scoffed at it, but then he invited 15 or 20 to his home, suggesting they bring their own decks of cards. Not only did Dr. Hooker permit them to shuffle their own decks, but confidently told them to mark certain cards by writing their names on them, placing the deck in a drinking glass. He ordered specific cards to rise, then capped it by having the owner's name card pop up. For his encore, Dr. Hooker placed the glass beneath a bell jar so that nothing could be attached to the deck. Walking away, he spoke to one or more cards, and up they came. After researching this feat for years, I finally got to go to work. Then put an ESP twist on it. I asked 3 different people in the audience to think of a card, each from one deck, but to remain silent as to the selection. They are requested to concentrate on their card. I hand another deck to a lady down front, a volunteer, and then escort her to the stage. She deposits that deck into the goblet, which is on a table. I then leave the stage and join the audience. As I receive the impression from the first person, the card he or she has in mind rises. The second subject is requested to concentrate deeply. I ask the volunteer on the stage to please squeeze the goblet. The second card rises. At this point, I turn to the stage and I enclose the goblet in a bell jar. Thanks to Dr. Hooker's pioneering, I request the third person to concentrate, then walk away about 20 paces, finally turning indignantly to shout, "Rise card." I think I get a bigger bang out of it than the audience when the card pops up. All of these demonstrations are attempts to show energy forces at work, though none of them are accomplished by purely psychological means. Legitimate scientific principles involving physical movement are used. For instance, the cigarette papers are never tricked or pre-treated. I offered them for chemical analysis. One of the 3 demonstrations, the chalk writing, is by far the most complicated. It is a controlled situation similar to the card levitation and the ash effect, but much more elaborate. I have to laugh when someone targets the water as the key to the chalk effect. The water is simply to ensure an impression of the chalk. It becomes saturated and sticky after it is dropped into the glass. I can't gamble on hard chalk to write 100% of the time. As the slates are held paralleled over the floor by the 2 participants, there is a natural tendency for hand movement. No human can hold an object perfectly still. There is always a slight nervous reaction. I take complete advantage of this mobile state to guide their writing. Oshi, in this instance, I cause the chalk to write the thought that is in their minds by control of their hands. The 2 participants never physically touch the chalk. It is a mixture of thought perception, suggestibility, and natural physical forces. These particular demonstrations are plainly labeled as effects and removed, in a way, from the straight parapsychology portions of the shows or concerts. As an entertainer must be, or should be, versatile, and I attempt to be. Table tilting or table moving is supposedly straight out of the seance setting and medium bag of tricks, or some people claim that it is a psychokinetic manifestation. Unfortunately, perhaps for me, I have never seen what I would consider to be absolute proof of movement of an inanimate, brainless object by mental force alone. It may occur, but I just have happened been around when it has happened. More than that, I've tried very hard to move ashtrays and waste baskets and even feathers by sheer mental will force. So far, I've not been able to move anything by so-called pure psychokinetic force. Yet I've tilted and moved tables on my own show, the David Frost Show and Johnny Carson stage. No psychokinesis or telekinesis or teleportation, as it is also termed, is involved. I usually employ one or more card tables, light but strong. The hands of the four subjects at each table are placed firmly on the top, palms down, with the right little finger touching the left little finger of the person to the right, the reverse with the opposite hand. In that way, there is magnetic and dynamic contact between all four persons. On signal, the tables often move so violently that the sitters have to stand up. The tables actually travel. One fell into an orchestra pit. Another went through the rear curtain backdrop with all four participants racing with it. In Dallas at the University of Texas, I remember that the card table supplied me was flimsy and kept collapsing. It can be a very funny routine. 10 tables dancing almost simultaneously, 40 people with open mouths, yet it is a legitimate phenomenon. On the Carson show, the table rammed Johnny Carson's desk. On the Frost show, 2 of the 4 tables flipped over. Frost became so interested in the dancing tables that he stopped the flow of other guests to question the participants. One girl said she felt moving water on the tabletop. A man said that it seemed as if electricity was in the table. Others said that their hands seemed to go numb. Table tilting is based on the dynamic responses of the nervous system to thought and is not remotely supernatural or mediumistic. The effect is akin to the action of the Ouija board or Ouija board, and in the family of automatic writing, not even a distant cousin to psycho-cybernetics. The table tilts or moves as the result of automatic responses in our nervous systems triggered by mental concentration. 8 hands build up stresses to accomplish this strange phenomenon. Each person knows what he wants to happen. Each concentrates physically. It was once described to me as a chemical neuromuscle response, requiring physical contact, which is the separation point for so-called psychokinesis. The Phoenix, a magician's magazine of the 40s, relates a story of 8 magicians who questioned the phenomenon, believing that table tilting was a fake. It can be phony, but there is no reason for it. They gathered in the New York City and sat at a heavy oaken table for an hour. The whole table went over. For party fun, any 4 people can tilt tables all over the place. Best results demand firm contact of the palms on the card table. Surface physical contact with the partners, like fingers touching, and then some patience. First tries may take 30 minutes. I speed up the process with my subjects through suggestibility. Similitary automatic writing is often draped in the phony garments of the occult and placed in seance rooms. To bring it into true light, the reader of this book may practice automatic writing. It requires sitting down for 5 minutes a day for a few weeks with a pencil in the writing hand and be right or left. Let the pencil rest slightly on a piece of paper and clear the mind by thinking of something far removed. Attempt to make it unaware of the pencil or pad. Daydream if possible. It may not work the first few days simply because not all people can clear their minds without some conditioning. Do not try to make the mind a blank. It cannot be done. But sooner or later, the pencil will move, and automatically. At first, the pencil may only make simple lines of zigzags. Continued sessions, however, will produce letters. They will run together since the pencil is not lifted. Additional sessions will eventually bring words, responses from the unconscious telegraphed to the paper without guided thought. On rare occasions, the transcript will be reversed, necessitating a mirror. It is a strange phenomenon, and the people who mirror write seem to do it consistently. In contrast to this legitimate area of mental dynamics energy, I have, for effect, levitated objects in recent years after abandoning magic. Not long ago, I requested 2 female volunteers to place their hands on a rather heavy French table along with mine. We appeared to levitate the table across the stage and down into the audience. There were no wires or hooks, and it was not a trick table. I requested the audience to examine it. However, it was a physical, not psychological technique. Though I now create visual illusions as much for self-amusement as for the stage, some take years to perfect. I work on them at odd times, finding it fun. Ball and goblet. Dating back to my wind-up years as a magician is in that category. It took 15 years. Visually, the concept is simple, but the mechanics are complex. I constructed an oblong wooden box with the front side open and exposed. If a small draw curtain was not pulled, placing a sponge rubber ball against the left wall of the box, I put an ordinary champagne goblet upright against the opposite wall. The goal was to persuade the ball to travel across the floor of the box and hop into the goblet. Since 1957, I've had more failures than successes with it, but in 1972, I finally made a public test at the Hillsburg Catholic High School in New Jersey. Prior to that morning performance, I practiced in my manager's office from about 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. Final rehearsal of some 200, 3 or 4 times I made the ball move a few inches. Once I found it inexplicably at the back, logged up between the cabinet wall and the goblet. However, I persuaded it to hop into the glass 4 times and decided I was ready to try it before the high school seniors. The ball performed. Having tried out in Phillipsburg, I packed the cabinet and flew to Ottawa. Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder, authors of a fascinating book entitled Psychic Discoveries Behind Iron Curtain, were to be special guests on that particular taping. So I decided to use them as witnesses and assistants, requesting them to examine the cabinet, which was placed on a sheet of glass between 2 chairs. I also asked them to check the ball to eliminate the possibility of an electronic device being hidden within, and to search for wires of other physical attachments. After a moment, they seemed satisfied. I was standing about 10 feet away. Sheila drew the small curtain on the cabinet, and I counted to 5, at which time she pulled the curtain again. I noticed that the ball had literally crawled about 3 inches, then stopped. The goblet was empty. If an effect doesn't work on TV, I usually move on to something else due to the time factor. But on this occasion, I couldn't bring myself to abandon years of effort in 5 seconds. I asked the producer, Dick Reed, if we could try again and keep the cameras rolling. He agreed, and this time the ball behaved. Later, Miss Ostrander said, "Come on, Kreskin, how did you do it?" Someone standing nearby, the curtain did it. I stepped back. One of the oldest ploys in magic is to entrap the witness by performing a logical explanation for the effect or illusion, then shatter the explanation. Thurston and Blackstone were masters at it. I proceeded to dismantle the entire cabinet in 5 seconds, demonstrating the total absence of gimmetry. Others have gone to their graves with certain effects, and I hope to go to mine with a few. I don't refuse information simply to annoy people, but having spent time perfecting several special physical entertainment techniques, such as linking or finger rings from the audience, I'll go to a point in discussing them and then stop. When illusion and effects are concerned, I'd rather lead an audience steeped in mystery. Also, there is a guardianship that stems from early conjuring an overwhelming desire to provoke the irresistible. From the audience, it's heady. One of Houdini's greatest escape tricks was the Chinese water torture cabinet. He was hung upside down in stocks in a cabinet containing water. It seemed a coffin. You pinned it with a glass front. Plunged down into it, he could only survive on the air that was in his lungs. The curtains were closed, and a moment later he appeared on stage, dripping and bowing. Along with others, I studied this effect for years. Finally, I discovered the methodology he used to escape the Puritan stocks and then opened the outer padlock on the coffin. Eventually, I was able to obtain a copy of the original plans of the cabinet. Only 2 or 3 sets exist, to my knowledge, and I treasure mine. Many of Houdini's effects defied solution long after his death. Thankfully, his assistants refused to reveal the methods. In time, I probably do a variation of the Chinese water torture cabinet, keeping it to an ESP application. Leaving most performers grasping, television devours both talent and material nightly, constantly forcing new applications. Even nightclubs and college circuits place great demands on material. The entertainer who repeats himself year after year soon faces a diminishing audience. Although the public usually demands his specialties or trademarks, the only solution is yearly development of additional effects, twist on past applications. Polishing touches are now being put on a new one in which a member of the audience will extract a coin from his pocket and concentrate on the date. If I perceive it correctly, it will appear on the bottom of a sole-coated tin lid held by a volunteer on stage. Another volunteer will pass a candle flame back and forth under the lid to register the date. It is admittedly a variation of the cigarette paper effect, combined through perception with a visual denouncement. Few effects are entirely new, but by 1975, I hope I will have discarded it for something more unique. Chapter 10. When communications is without sound, darkness seems to present an odd barrier. I have perceived thoughts with the audience and stage completely blacked out. But for reasons unknown, perhaps psychological, the communication is always easier when the sender can see me. It may be the security of visual contact. We aren't moles by nature. I first tried thought perceptions while blindfolded on the Mike Douglas show. It was a new and not altogether pleasant sensation. I was telepathically directed by comedian Moms Marley to follow a circuitous route toward a balloon held by someone in the audience. A vision of Pin, the tail on the donkey. I managed to puncture the balloon on the first try, but en route almost fell over a camera. Moms forgot to warn me. I was moving rather quickly. I've also been successful at going out into an audience blindfolded and select twins seated separately while the parents were concentrating on stage. Although I've never tried it, I think this guidance would be much more difficult if the parents were blindfolded too and simply give me row and seat references. I do not think that telepathy can work readily with an unseen total stranger. Perhaps someone in the adjoining hotel room. It would be a major breakthrough if I was proved wrong. But I'm inclined to believe that a brief moment to establish rapport is necessary. It could be accomplished on the phone or with a few seconds of both visual and verbal contact. As an example of this, I did an interview on the John Wingate show over New York's radio station WOR. During the interview, an engineer left the booth and came into the studio, and we chatted for a moment. Returning to the booth, he wrote a word on a slip of paper, then began concentrating on it. In my mic position, I could neither see nor hear him, yet was able to pick up the word in about 30 seconds. We had that brief moment of rapport. I cannot, nor do I try to perceive the thoughts of anyone upon meeting them, nor do I attempt to do it in everyday contact. For many reasons, I limit any effort at thought perception to performances. A person's thoughts should be inviolate unless he wishes to divulge them. More than that, I'm not interested. Thought perception in auditoriums, theaters, or nightclubs is obviously simpler but more open to skepticism than long-range thought readings where the subject cannot be seen but can be heard. Skepticism within the confines of a room results from the possibility of reading facial expressions or the possible use of stooges. Either way, the latter would be a risky undertaking. I'd been fascinated with the possibilities of long-range mental telepathy since first reading of writer Harold Sherman's attempt to contact Sir Herbert Wilkins telepathically in the Arctic. The 1937 tests were believed to have failed until one night when Sherman couldn't concentrate because he saw flames. He did not know the location of the flames. Later, it was revealed that at the same relative moment, the explorer was too busy to receive. He was helping to extinguish a fire. It could have been coincidence. The odds are much greater that it was not coincidence. One of my first attempts to individual long-range thought perception was conducted on the Mike Douglas show in October of 1969. We decided to test this ESP concept as dramatically as possible and in full audience view over 3,000-mile range. Mike was given a phone number by his staff and dialed it. Since the show was on tape, the person called would not be able to monitor it. See, Douglas or myself, we were in the KYW TV studio in Philadelphia. The phone rang in Los Angeles and a female voice said, "Hello." At first, I didn't recognize the voice, and neither did Douglas. But soon, Mike became aware that Carol Burnett was on the other end. She'd been informed that I would attempt to read her thoughts and that the only setting in both places would be a glass of water, a pad, and a pencil. Now, not at all certain it would work over the range of distance, I divided the test into 3 parts. First, I told her to look into the glass of water and think of any 3 or 4-digit number. In Philadelphia, I studied the surface of my water glass, hoping for the image of the numbers. The water acting as a mirror was for my benefit, not hers. In a moment, I received the sequence and wrote it on a slate, which was immediately covered with masking tape so that Douglas could not see it. Additionally, I did not want to stand accused of altering figures before the end of the test. I then asked her to think of a word, any word, and concentrate deeply on it. After a few seconds, I received the word, seeing the image on the water, and wrote it on another slate, which was also quickly covered. For the last step, I said, "Carol, I don't know the room you're in, but look around it. Think of some object in the room, anywhere in the room." There was a pause which should have told me something, but it didn't register. Then I heard her voice. Yes, Kreskin, I'm thinking of something. I received it and wrote it down. Then Douglas pulled the first tape off tape, and Carol from Los Angeles repeated the three-digit number, 921. I'd hit and breathed a sigh of relief. She called off the word, baby, and the second tape was pulled, and I got that one too. I asked over the phone, what was the object? And the answer, well, I'm not at home, and I'm in my agent's office. I'm looking at a painting on the wall. That's what I was thinking of. Douglas' staff pulled the third tape, and I had written bronze statue. Puzzled as well as disappointed, I admitted I made a mistake. Yet I was certain that the image I received on her water image surface, an image there but not there, mirrored from my mind, was a bronze statue. Suddenly Carol yelped, one of those well-known, delightful Burnett yelps. Kreskin, when you told me to think of something, I changed my mind. The first thing I thought of was this bronze paperweight I'm holding. It's a small statue, but then I thought of the painting. Now I understood the phase. While I knew that short-range telepathy worked within a room or building or any other distance of a few miles within the city, I was now satisfied that it could travel thousands of miles between a sender and a receiver. After telephonic report was established, it could deal in specifics if the contact was sharp. Carol Burnett, of course, was an excellent choice for the experiment. She was accustomed to concentration and receptive to the idea that it would work. Although we'd never met, we had seen each other on TV. A few moments of conversation provided the required rapport. The text also convinced me, at last, that distance does not always decrease mental reception, unlike radio and video communication. Even earlier than the Burnett show, groping on my own, I'd used a mass and rather scientific approach to long-range telepathy, acting as the sender rather than the receiver. The concept was simple enough. I would sit in my office on West 57th Street in New York for 14 nights and concentrate on one subject each night, hopeful that X number of people could read my single thought. I was assuming some rapport might be possible on the basis that volunteers, though strangers, would have previously seen me and heard my voice on TV. I decided on 200 as a workable number, but was astonished when 3,800 people worldwide volunteered for the test. They wrote in from Canada, England, Germany, and Italy, as well as the United States, requesting a wide segment, fortunately from show people to postmen, housewives, and students. They included several astronauts and many professional categories. 3/4 were women. There was no way of knowing whom to reject, so I accepted all of them. The test period was set between Sunday, March 17th, and Saturday, March 30th, 1968. I instructed my secretary to select 100 objects. Each item placed in a sealed envelope would be deposited in a shopping bag. There were no limitations except that the items would have to be small enough to be inserted into the envelopes. Some of her topics were found excuse me. Some of her topics were found in newspapers. With her eyes closed, she pulled a knife randomly on dictionary pages and then copied the word that the blade hit. The scope, of course, was inexhaustible. Meanwhile, we notified the volunteers that the test would run from 7 to 7:05 Eastern Standard Time on each night, and that I would have no knowledge of the topic until I reached into the grab bag and ripped the envelope open. I would then sit at my desk for 5 minutes, thinking only of the object in my hand. On the first night, Sunday, March 17th, I reached for an envelope, opened it, and extracted a Band-Aid, wrapping it around my finger. I not only mentally identified the object, but gave a description of it, attempting the deepest possible concentration. I repeated it over and over. I also attempted to photograph it in my mind and then send that picture in the manner that a wire photo is sent. Within 2 weeks after the first test, I discovered that I have to hire a staff to evaluate the results properly. Mail diluted the office as roughly 95% of the volunteers responded, not waiting until the completion of the 14 nights. The targets transmitted were March 17th, Band-Aid. March 18th, newspaper clipping of actress Elizabeth Taylor, who had flown into New York from Europe. She was dressed in white fur, holding a black pocket book, standing near the aircraft. March 19th, a garter strap and button in white cloth. March 20th, a lock of hair. March 21st, cotton swab stick with cotton on both ends. March 22nd, press-only badge. March 23rd, news clip photo of oceanographic lab. March 24th, woman's binge and white leather belt. March 25th, magazine cutout of portrait of Picasso's son. March 26th, red golf tree. March 27th, cutout of Miller High Life beer ad. March 28th, a news clip of prisoner in yard after prison riot. B, silver bottle top from non-fat milk. March 29th, I slept during testing period, hopeful of drawing a blank. March 14th, March 30th, ad clip of woman brushing teeth while holding an aspirin for a headache. The 200 of the receivers had almost direct hits on each night. 25 had 3 or more hits. 75 had 2 hits. 100 had 1 correct hit. 5% of all participants had significant or near misses. Although these percentages might seem small in relation to the roughly 3,000 participants, I think they are remarkable. I would have been pleased with 5 direct hits. We found that the largest percentage of success with a single target was the new picture of Elizabeth Taylor, dressed in white, ermine holding a white pocketbook and a white muff. Oddly enough, no one named her. However, a number said they saw her picture of a famous actress or a famous lady. Several said she was dressed in total white standing by an airplane. This was almost the identical description I was trying to send that night. I did name her, hopeful that a few people would receive it. Apparently, it is much more difficult to receive a name than to receive a mental picture. On March 20th, many people thought of a pine tree when that target was a lock of hair. There is a symbolic similarity, a topping or spread of material. On March 26th, a number of returns named the Eiffel Tower. It is analyzing this impression. Though I may be reaching, I feel it worth noting that the Eiffel Tower does resemble an inverted golf tee, the target for that evening's test. A small percentage sent various and confused images the night that I slept. A total of 28 cities in the United States and Canada were involved in the test, and 5 European cities. Philadelphia had the highest overall score. Washington, D.C. had no success at all. I have no idea how to evaluate these results aside from the obvious fact that there were more sensitive volunteers in the city of brotherly love than in the city of politics. It was the first such test, to my knowledge, on a national and international scale. I think it was successful. 6 months was required to collaborate the percentages. Among other indications, we found that women scored higher than men. This doesn't necessarily indicate that women are more sensitive to ESP. More tests would have to be made with equal proportions of male and female subjects. However, I generally found that females are inclined to be less openly skeptical of ESP. Males may not express their opinions to the same degree. The next great adventure in this area is outer space telepathy. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell attempted to make that bridge during the noon shot on April 14th, January and February 1971. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time for careful preparation, and Mitchell's other duties understandably prevented anything more than a sketchy test. He sent twice on the outward flight and made another 2 attempts on the return. The results were disappointing. Even so, Michael opened the door to new American experiments in ESP. Once more, Russia is ahead of the United States in this area, having already experimented for a number of years. Advances have been claimed, outer space ESP has been attempted, and they're gone in the other direction, placing a receiver 4 stories beneath the Earth with the sender on the surface, attempting to control thinking and response behavior. For a nation that has permitted public discussion of even psychoanalysis and that has cast Dr. Freud as a dangerous influence, it is both interesting and somewhat frightening to observe the Soviet Union's current insolubility efforts to parapsychology and related fields. In researching their book on current efforts in Russia, Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder noted an emphasis on the sender rather than the receiver, which is the reverse of the American interest. The Russians, they told me, appear to be looking for people who can project ideas into the minds of others. They are also apparently showing a great deal of interest in psychokinesis. When the author appeared on my program, I showed the Russian film clips of a woman who sat at a table causing buttons and matchsticks and other objects to move by mental force. Her hands were at least a foot from the objects, her feet visible and motionless under the table. She also moved on camera. A compass dial by holding her hands over it. Prior to this sequence, she was examined to make certain that no tiny magnets had been hidden beneath the fingernails. Evaluation of the film is always difficult, but this footage was totally unconvincing. I do not doubt that the natural and physical magnetism can move a compass dial under certain circumstances. However, the Russian footage looked and felt staged. The author said that the Russian scientists they interviewed repeatedly beseeched them to tell their American colleagues to use USP only for peaceful purposes. Much as I'd prefer to think otherwise, I'm strongly of the opinion that the Soviets doeth protest too much. Not surprisingly, Joseph Stalin banned all research into ESP, yet surprisingly, superficially long ago, he used wolf messaging, the famous Russian mentalist, as a consultant. Stalin obviously believed in the scientific application of parapsychology, but his own devious mentality saw it fit to save it for future machines. Messaging had fled from the Nazi invasion of Poland after Hitler put a price tag of 200,000 Deutschmarks on his head. His reputation was such that when he reached Russia, Stalin wanted proof of his ability. He reportedly told Meslin to rob the Bank of Moscow of 100,000 rubles using his power of suggestion or hypnosis, or whatever he wanted to term the talent. According to Meslin, wrote a note on school scratch paper and visited the bank. Apparently, a cashier, he took the note from his attached case and passed it over to the counter. Meslin also claims to have willed the cashier to disperse the money. However, it was never done. Meslin went back to the Kremlin, mission accomplished, along with a few Stalin officials who witnessed the robbery. He then returned to the package of rubles to the cashier, who promptly suffered a heart attack. The story, true or not, added to the legend of the great wolf messenger, who is still alive, still entertaining, at last report. To the general world, at least, the psychoparasology efforts in Russia surfaced in a benign way in the 60s, when it became clear that her Olympic weightlifters and the gymnastics had been trained in autosuggestion. Both of these endeavors, basically involving individual powers, are excellent platforms for improvements by autosuggestion. Now, the prospect is that Russia may be leading the world in a field potentially more important than Olympics. In 1960, the late Dr. Leonid Vasily, one of the Soviet Union's foremost psychologists, established a special laboratory for telepathy research at the University of Leningrad. That same year, Dr. Vasily started a distinguished gossip of Russian scientists by glittering, disgusting mental radio. ESP was coming out from under red square wraps. In 1962, Dr. Kreskin was finally permitted to publish his book, Experiments in Mental Suggestion, detailing the work that dated back to 1932. Sometime during the early 30s, about the time that Dr. Ringe began to work at Duke, eventually then at the St. Petersburg Brain Institute, was given orders to find a solution to telepathy. The belief was that a physical explanation to telepathy existed, An attempt would be to take it out of the supernatural. Remaining in the foggy area, they posed a threat in dialect materialism. If the Russians have indeed found a solution to telepathy, which is doubtful, they haven't shared it. But another step in the early 60s was the founding of a commission for the study of mental suggestion at the St. Petersburg Brain Institute. A considerable time before his death, Dr. Vensey said, discovery of the energy held in the ESP phenomenon will be comparable to the discovery of the atomic energy. And that's it for today. We're all done. I hope everybody enjoyed that. We'll start back on Tuesday on chapter 11. And I hope everybody enjoys what I'm doing here. And I hope everybody has a fantastic day. And I will see you again on next Tuesday. And thank you very much. And God bless all of you. Bye-bye.